Hi, everybody. Over the past couple of weeks in Grade 12 Law, we've been looking at a number of topics connected with international law and international legal agreements. And in particular, we've talked about a couple of core ideas. We discussed for the first few classes the idea of the sovereignty principle and how that obviously is important when nations of the world come together and negotiate with one another. We also talked a little bit about treaties and how they're formed, how they're signed. We looked a little bit at diplomats and diplomatic immunity. And finally, over the last couple of classes, we've talked a little bit about extradition and how that's used in countries like Canada today. This class, and really for the next week or so, and it will be the last big topic for the year, we're going to continue forward and we're going to look a little bit at the historical origins of one of the most important international organizations, and that is the UN. We're going to look today at where the UN came from and why it was first formed. And then moving into next week, we'll start to look a little bit at just what the UN looks like, what the different parts of the UN are, what they're responsible for, and how they work just in terms of their overall structure and function. To start off with, if we're going to be looking at where the UN came from, it's important to note that it's certainly not the first international organization on record. International organizations are not a new thing, and in many respects, they go back many, many years, in some cases, much longer back in time than even most of the nations of the world today. To give you a couple of examples of that, if you consider factors like religion, well, there's groups like the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church or other different institutions for other religions that go back many, many hundreds of years. And in fact, for many years had as important, if not perhaps even more important, a role in people's daily lives as their normal local governments would have. Similarly, there have been many opportunities throughout time where countries or nations have decided that they wanted to work together in order to provide for what they would call collective security. And so those alliances, which in some cases had a proper organization behind them, they also would represent an old-fashioned form of international organization that goes back quite a ways. To give you an example, if you looked at the Iroquois Confederacy, or what we would today call the Haudenosaunee, in the area of sort of northern New York and parts of Ontario, a lot of different independent tribes that for years would work together when there was a threat, particularly in terms of warfare. And that model of having the ability to work together for military support became kind of an important model for what would eventually become the federal principle in both Canada and the United States in our constitutions. Here you can just see sort of Catholicism, and you'll notice that, I mean, if you look at just the percentage of people who are Catholics practicing today, especially in Latin America, parts of Asia, parts of Africa, and certainly in parts of Europe, it's an organization that really transcends borders and is quite critical. And that picture there just shows you a little bit about the Iroquois and where the different groups were and how they sort of bonded together at times in order to provide for a collective military organization when they were threatened. You also, if you're going to be considering the history of international organizations, need to consider the fact that not only have we had these large, large organizations which have transcended borders, go back hundreds of years, but in many cases we've also had different organizations formed for particular purposes. When the 19th century and early 20th century started to roll around, world travel started to become a lot more easy and common. Communication became much faster and easier. And the global village, while it was still in its infancy, it was starting to become really more of a genuine article. And as that occurred, there were a lot of different groups that decided that they wanted to actually establish themselves as proper organizations that could provide for support that really wasn't necessarily tied or linked to one country. In fact, could many ways actually break down borders, or at least exist without borders getting in the way. There's lots of examples. We won't go over all of them, but things like the International Red Cross, which provides for humanitarian aid in time of warfare, also looks after things like, for example, blood services. It goes back for many, many years and has always served an important purpose. Groups like Amnesty International for Human Rights, Oxfam, Greenpeace, even groups like FIFA or the International Olympic Committee. These are important international organizations that have deep, deep roots and go back for more than 100 years. One of the things, though, that you haven't seen on that list, and that is a little bit more modern in terms of its formation, is the idea of a potential world government body. And there's a number of reasons why that would be. Usually, if we had class, we would discuss a little bit about what would make it so difficult to have a single world government We have actually already talked about that a little bit, though, if you think back to the first lesson of the year. And the reality is that while it's perhaps a noble principle, and it's certainly something that, as you'll see with the UN, we've tried to, in some regards, introduce over the last 70 to 80 years, there's always been a lot of opposition towards that idea. There's different cultures around the world, many different people with many different values. There's the challenge of trying to unite and getting people to work together with many different languages, which can create a barrier. There's the history of warfare and animosity between different groups in different countries that really creates an obstacle towards working together in peace. And then finally, there's this question that we have as a core part of international law, the idea of sovereignty. So much of that has historically been developed at the national level that giving that up and having sort of a world government body over top or superseding national governments, it creates a lot of challenges in terms of just how much are those countries willing to give up their legitimacy in terms of their power, and how much are they willing to let this body oversee them and actually have enforcement rights. If you look at groups like the European Union, which is probably the closest we've ever had to a true world government, there are opportunities for that body to have influence, and certainly it has taken on a more sort of sovereign role compared to just the individual states, and states have given their sovereignty up. But that hasn't come without controversy, and definitely if you look at debates like Brexit in Great Britain today, where the UK is in the process of pulling out of the European Union, it certainly shows that there's always kind of a divide between the idea of having sort of a world government, but also being willing to give it proper authority to make it work. All of those things being said, there was one event in the 20th century which at least convinced a lot of countries that had always been resistant towards the idea of a full and proper world government to at least consider introducing some kind of forum that could provide for that purpose. The event is probably one that wouldn't be surprising if you followed your history classes. I'll show you a couple of slides and you can look at the pictures here. And of course, as I finish up, you'll know that that particular event was World War One. World War One happened between 1914 and 1918, and it was one of the most horrific events in human history. Technology had increased to a point where millions of people could be killed in a matter of a day or more in terms of horrific warfare that nobody had seen before. And the event also happened really because of just a breakdown of basic relationships between countries. A lot of people looked at it and they said that, you know what, we cannot take these risks anymore, and we cannot let little sparks like what happened with the Archduke Ferdinand in Austria Hungary in Sarajevo in 1914 lead to such a horrific conflict. We need to have an opportunity to create a dialogue forum where nations can come together and they can try to work out their issues and hopefully have a little bit more constructive ability to, I guess, forge a better future. The League of Nations was the first effort to try to provide for those sorts of things. And you'll note it wasn't the UN. In fact, this was an effort that, while noble, didn't quite work the way that people had wanted it to. The League of Nations was kind of like a UN body, and it was formed after World War One at the suggestion of the American president, whose name was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had been, for many years, to a certain extent, a pacifist. He was horrified by what had happened in World War One, and at the end of the war, he penned a very famous document called the 14 Points, where he made a number of recommendations for how Europe and really the whole world should come together and try to prevent war in the future. One of the suggestions was that they would set up a government-like body, and that government-like body would oversee conversations between different countries and provide for collective security. So if there was a threat that was unnecessary from one country towards any member nation, then the League would hopefully step in and not only provide dialogue, but also, if necessary, provide for military support to provide really just security against that kind of thing, leading into the sort of domino effect that created World War One. Kind of an ironic thing that Woodrow Wilson had actually promoted the League of Nations, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes. The Americans really should have been there. They were the most important country in the world at the time. In order for the United Nations, or sorry, for the League of Nations to become something that the Americans would join, they had to, like any treaty, because it was formed through treaty, push things through via a vote through their Congress. They couldn't get the two-thirds support because Woodrow Wilson didn't have the support of most of the people within the Senate at the time. And embarrassingly for him, even though it was really at least his idea, or partly his idea, the Americans never joined. And it started to set in, at least at that particular moment, set in motion one of a series of problems that really undercut the League for years to come. The way the League worked was as follows. It was essentially meant to be a forum which would be like a world government body. It wouldn't have full authority. It wouldn't be a total world government, but rather what it would do is it would create a government-like body where the members of the different countries would meet, they would discuss issues, and they would try to work out solutions when there were problems or conflicts. The other idea was that it was supposed to ensure peace because there would be a system of collective security, and the hope, at least, was that if there was a threat to one of the member nations, and there were about 50 nations that joined this original group, then all of the other nations would debate whether that threat was something that had any legitimate purpose to it, and if not, they would step in and provide support. And that would hopefully discourage any country from becoming an aggressor and creating the moves that would lead towards a new world war. The League met in Geneva, Switzerland. Geneva, Switzerland was a logical choice for a few reasons. First and foremost, it was a location where there already were a number of organizational headquarters for different NGOs, like the International Red Cross. The other reason why was that Geneva, while they were a member of the League of Nations, they'd often been sort of neutral in different conflicts. They were right in the center of Europe. It was a very Eurocentric organization. Don't forget, this is a period where colonialism was still very much prominent, and most of the most powerful nations of the world, with the exception of maybe Japan and the United States, were located within the European Forum. And so having a nation in the center of Europe just made sense. Now, was that ignoring the needs of the rest of the world? Was that showing, as I've mentioned, a Eurocentric bias? Of course. And in many respects, it was a problem with the organization making that particular choice. But within the context of the early 20th century, it was a sensible location that fit with what a lot of decisions had been at that particular time. A lot of treaties are often signed in Switzerland or Austria, countries in the middle of the continent. In addition to having headquarters in Geneva, they also formed a few other bodies which actually outlived the League of Nations and have become really important to this day. One of them was they set up a permanent court of justice called the ICJ, and the ICJ became a forum where nations could go to if there was ever a dispute in terms of international law. Judges from many different countries would hear those I guess, disputes and make recommendations based on the foundations or principles of international law through treaties that were existing. That actually became a part of the UN, and we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. The other organization, which was important, which is still there, is called the International Labour Organization. It promoted social justice and labor rights and became very important for the defense of workers around the world, which was obviously a big thing and continues to be to this day. There you can see the headquarter locations where the different delegates met in Geneva, kind of like the UN, a little different just in that the UN obviously has that sort of almost sort of spherical look, whereas this is more of just sort of a standard I guess, parliamentary style body, but you get the idea. All the different countries there were there, and they would meet. It looked like the League of Nations would be a useful thing. And in fact, many people thought that it would exist for many years and it would grow to become an important stabilizing force in the world. Unfortunately, while there was a lot of good intentions in 1919 when it formed, within a few short years, it was pretty clear that the organization was not working. And in fact, by the time that World War II started, it was really clear that the League of Nations had been a complete failure that had not met its mandate. There was a number of reasons why. Okay, these are worth noting. The first was the fact that there are a lot of countries that should have been there that weren't. The United States, in particular, was a major country, and even though they were what they called isolationists, they tried to avoid getting involved in world and European, in particular, affairs if they could. They still were notable. They had a key role in terms of the balance of power, and the fact that they couldn't get to that table, the fact that they held out, really kind of gave the League a lack of legitimacy. It felt just weird not having that biggest country in the world there. They also didn't include Germany. They did eventually include them by the 1920s, but by then it was too late. Germany was punished for their role within World War I. We know that that obviously created problems. It actually created a lot of the impetus for World War II. And not including Germany, even though they'd been really an aggressor in World War I, was a mistake because they didn't get to participate within that peace-mongering organization, and they were kind of left out and left to sort of feel like they weren't part of things. Russia was also left out because, of course, they'd had a communist revolution, and so once again, you've got a massive country and eventually becoming the Soviet Union, of course, that really should have been there. And not being there, you've got the USA missing, you've got Germany missing for a long time, you've got Russia missing. You're starting to see that this is sort of like a scattered organization that's missing some of the voices that really should be there if it's a world representative body. One of the other issues was the fact that they didn't have an army to solve disputes. And so if there was ever a threat from one country towards another country, there were often recommendations made by the League not to do so. And there were sometimes sternly worded, I guess, statements made by the body that these sorts of actions would be inappropriate. But the problem, and we'll look at this in the next couple of points, was that when countries would become aggressors, whether it was Germany or Italy, as they started to grow their military-based nations in the 20s and 30s, unfortunately, and Japan as well, unfortunately, nothing really happened. And quickly it became kind of a joke that the League of Nations just never really did anything. A few examples would include the following. Italy had always wanted to have a larger, I guess, colonial network. They hadn't really joined the forum the way that other countries had. When Mussolini came to power, he invaded Ethiopia, which was one of the few remaining independent African states. A lot of people condemned that. A lot of people said that that shouldn't have happened, that you shouldn't have more extension of colonialism in the 20th century. A little bit ironic because a lot of the criticizers were countries like Britain and France, which were still maintaining quite large empires at the time. But nevertheless, it was a threat that really was scolded, but nobody did anything. And so a lot of people just sort of said, okay, well, the League's not really that useful. Germany had also made some invasions of different parts of Africa. Japan had gone into Manchuria, which is a part of northern China. And again, as nothing occurred, it started to become very, very clear that the League was just not fulfilling its purpose and was actually kind of a big joke by the time that World War II ran around or came around. Here you can see a picture of the time that reflects those ideas. You'll notice this is a cartoon suggesting the League is a bunny. The international, I guess, different organizations or countries that are a little bit more aggressive are threatening it, and that the League just can't do anything. It's powerless in the face of those threats. Here you can see again the idea that the League is a dog with no teeth. This is particularly looking at the invasion of Ethiopia by Italy from some of its existing, I guess, colonies at the time. Widely condemned, but nobody did anything. And then Japan, which was really trying to grow its empire, especially in the early part of the 20s and the 1930s, had invaded not only Korea, but in fact also took huge parts of northern China, and really infuriated people in the East, infuriated the Americans, and ultimately became an aggressor state in World War II, but probably could have been prevented if there was a little bit more collective action against those efforts at that particular time. There's sort of a picture of the League being stepped over by Japan. There again, you can see the idea that the League is just sort of a debating organization that doesn't really do anything. And Uncle Sam not there, but also just kind of watching while the sort of aggression built up. The key idea was that it was just an abject failure. And the League of Nations, by the time when World War II started in 1939, I think it was obvious that the League could never really continue, that there would have to be a new body put in its place. They could have given up. Certainly, that was an alternative that was discussed by a number of countries in the lead up to the end of World War II. But ultimately, the agreement was that no, the problem was not the League itself, but rather, or sorry, the idea of the League, but rather the particular way that the League had functioned and some of the weaknesses that were there from the beginning. And so in 1946, a new organization was set up. This organization was originally agreed upon in San Francisco and would be headquartered in New York. It would be the United Nations, and the hope would be that while 50 nations joined at the beginning, all of the nations of the world would eventually become part. We're going to see over the next couple of days, the UN is certainly not a perfect organization. It has a lot of weaknesses, just like the League did, but it has lasted and it has persisted to this day, and it is a very critical organization that certainly has had a lot more success than the League did. And a lot of that is just in part because of the fact that all nations eventually have bought in. And you'll note that today, with a couple of exceptions, and those are issues where sovereignty is obviously a question mark, There's 193 countries at the UN, and they're all a part of the General Assembly, which is the main forum within that particular body. There you can see the signing of the, San Francisco Treaty, which set up the UN with the 50 countries. Poland should have been there, but they didn't make it, so they're usually considered a founding member, but they just technically weren't there at the time. And then there you can see the headquarters in New York. And I think a lot of you, if you're in world issues, probably were lucky enough to get to visit the UN. It's a phenomenal building, an excellent place to get to visit. It's very interesting, and certainly it plays a very crucial role within the Congress of Nations today. There's lots of things that the UN does. We're going to talk more about these over the next couple of days, but they're there to provide peace, to provide friendly relations, to promote human rights, to solve international problems, particularly countries in the developing, what we used to call the third world, but the developing world in Africa and Asia. A lot of those countries really, really, really do like the ability to be at the UN because they get a voice that they might not get so much in other organizations like the G20. And they also get a lot of their needs dealt with in terms of things like international development, in terms of things like, for example, education and social goals. In fact, some of the most successful parts of the UN are those, subcommittees within the UN that deal with those issues. And we'll talk about them a little bit more in the days to come. They also provide a forum for international dialogue. The Security Council is not without its weaknesses. Certainly, it's not a perfect solution to the problems that existed within the League of Nations, but it's at least something that's there. Your homework for tonight. What I would like you to do is pretty straightforward. For Friday, we'll talk a little bit about some of the ideas we discussed in our lesson today, just to kind of review things. You can also use your textbook to go over some of those key points. Please read pages 497 to 500, and then using those pages plus what I've just discussed, answer questions 2 to 3 on page 499 and questions 1 to 2 on page 508, and we'll talk about them at the beginning of your next live lesson. Okay, thank you for listening.